The massive storm outside roared aggressively against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxurious Manhattan penthouse. But inside the sprawling, cold apartment, the Real, devastating tempest was actively tearing Ava Sinclair's entire life apart into jagged pieces. 6 months pregnant, completely barefoot on the cold stone, and still wearing the simple silk robe she had put on that morning, she stood absolutely frozen in the middle of the expansive, marble-floored living room. She watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as her husband, Ethan Cross, one of the most celebrated, famous young CEOs in the country, meticulously adjusted his expensive silver cufflinks. He was acting exactly as though he were preparing for a routine, boring corporate board meeting, instead of callously ending their marriage. "You'll be fine," he said, his voice clipped, sterile, and almost bored with the conversation. "This is simply the best decision for both of us moving forward. The board of directors firmly thinks the new, updated public image will significantly help the company's upcoming valuation." "The new image?" Ava's voice cracked violently, tears welling in her eyes. "You mean the young model you've been secretly seeing behind my back?" Ethan didn't even blink or show a shred of guilt. "Her name is Sienna Vale. She's poised, she's incredibly photogenic for the press, and she actually understands the fast-paced, elite life I live now. I simply can't have a wife who constantly hides from the spotlight like a frightened mouse." Hides from the spotlight. That was his convenient, highly curated version of the truth. In harsh reality, Ava had intentionally, actively avoided the aggressive paparazzi and the endless, shallow social events because she'd bravely chosen to live a quiet, normal life, far away from the cutthroat, toxic elite society she was born into. She had never, not once in their entire relationship, told Ethan her real last name. She had never let him glimpse the monumental truth about her massively wealthy family, her staggering multi-billion-dollar fortune, or the massive global tech empire her late mother had brilliantly founded before Ava was even born. To him, she was just Ava James, the soft-spoken, completely average, middle-class woman who'd been working quietly at an independent, obscure design studio when they first met. She was the naive woman who fell deeply for his aggressive confidence and his grand vision for his future. And now, he was literally throwing her away like yesterday's boring press release. "I'm pregnant." Ethan, her hand instinctively cupped her swollen belly protectively. "This is your biological child." His sharp jaw tightened in annoyance. "My corporate lawyers will arrange a very generous financial settlement for you. You'll have enough to live on." Enough. The terrible word landed on her skin like a physical slap across the face. Not love, not commitment, not even basic human respect, just enough hush money to make her go away quietly. The man who had once tearfully promised to protect her from the world now treated her exactly like a highly inconvenient business liability. He reached for his expensive camel hair coat draped over the sofa. "The driver is waiting downstairs. He will take you to your apartment, the small one over in Brooklyn. You'll be much more comfortable living there among your own kind." "I don't live in Brooklyn," she said, her voice trembling with absolute disbelief and rising anger. "That's a rundown storage unit you secretly bought just to hide me away from your rich friends." He didn't bother to answer her. He was already walking out the heavy mahogany door, leaving her completely alone in the cold, cavernous room. Ava Sinclair, though Ethan only knew her as Ava James, was 29 years old and a highly talented, visionary interior designer with an impeccable eye for both classic elegance and modern functionality. Or at least that was the highly edited, simple version of her life Ethan had been allowed to see. The real Ava had been born directly into the legendary Sinclair dynasty. She was the sole, uncontested heiress to Sinclair Technologies, a terrifyingly massive multinational giant that developed top-tier AI systems, impenetrable global cybersecurity solutions, and cutting-edge military software used exclusively by top governments and Fortune 500 companies around the world. Her late, brilliant mother, Elizabeth Sinclair, had been a true tech visionary. Her father, Charles, still proudly served as the intimidating chairman of the board. But immediately after her mother's tragic, sudden death, a grieving Ava had desperately begged her father for breathing space. The endless, fake networking events, the bloodthirsty journalists, the cutthroat corporate deals, it all felt absolutely suffocating to her soul. She had moved quietly to the city under an assumed, generic surname, fiercely determined to prove to herself that she could build a successful life that had absolutely nothing to do with her family's massive name or their billions. She never, ever expected that the charming man she'd fall so deeply in love with would one day discard and humiliate her in the most cruel, public way possible. The Cross penthouse was a sleek, towering testament to Ethan's massive, unchecked ambitions. It was a literal glass and steel fortress towering arrogantly above Manhattan. Every single corner meticulously curated by expensive decorators to project immense wealth and total dominance. Tonight, however, the massive space felt freezing cold, completely stripped of the warm, loving illusions Ava had once wrapped herself in to survive the marriage. In the corner of the room, a glossy business magazine lay casually open to a massive, glowing article about Ethan's latest corporate merger. On the opposite, glossy page was a high-definition photo of him and Sienna at a major charity gala just 3 nights ago. Her glittering, backless gown hugged a perfect body that aggressively screamed confidence and youth. The breathless headline gushed endlessly about Ethan's magnetic new power companion. Ava hadn't realized exactly how deep and public the betrayal ran until this very horrifying moment. Ethan's phone buzzed loudly on the marble entryway table. He glanced down at the bright screen and smiled warmly, an expression Ava suddenly, painfully realized she hadn't seen directed at her in many, many months. "Sienna's waiting downstairs in the car," he said, completely without an ounce of shame or guilt. "We're going to the Met Gala tonight. I'll have the final divorce papers couriered to you tomorrow morning. You're officially divorcing me while I'm 6 months pregnant, just so you can take a 22-year-old model to the Met Gala." Ava's voice rose sharply, echoing in the massive room. She absolutely didn't care if the wealthy neighbors heard her screaming. Ethan's gaze was dead and flat. The company desperately needs good PR stability right now. Major investors absolutely don't want a messy scandal with a frumpy, depressed wife dragging down the stock price. We'll release a statement making it look perfectly amicable to the press. She let out a loud, bitter, hysterical laugh. Stability? Ethan, you are literally creating a massive scandal. He stepped much closer to her, lowering his voice as though he were generously offering her a final, wise piece of corporate advice. "Ava, listen to me. You do not have the money or the power to fight me in court. Do not make this harder on yourself than it has to be. Just take the settlement and disappear." For the very first time that night, something deep inside her soul violently shifted. It wasn't hot anger, and it wasn't crushing grief. It was something much colder, much sharper, absolute, unadulterated power. She had the financial and corporate means to utterly ruin him, to brutally strip away every single shred of the massive empire he arrogantly thought he built without her. But she said absolutely nothing to him. Not yet. When Ethan finally walked out and the heavy door clicked shut, the deafening silence of the penthouse wrapped around her like a suit of heavy armor. She crossed the room slowly to the massive window, looking out at the glittering, sprawling city skyline. Somewhere out there in the dark, hidden safely behind tinted glass and locked iron gates, was the massive Sinclair estate. She hadn't stepped a single foot inside it for nearly 5 years, but she still possessed the heavy brass key. She pulled out her cheap cell phone and scrolled right past Ethan's block number to the one contact she had kept fiercely hidden, even from herself. Labeled simply, Uncle R. Her mother's brilliant, ruthless younger brother, Richard Sinclair, was the current, terrifying CEO of Sinclair Technologies. He was a man who famously never, ever forgot a slight against his family. Her shaking thumb hovered nervously over the call button. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pressed dial and waited. When his deep, familiar, commanding voice answered on the first ring with, "Ava, good God, is everything all right?" She smiled a dark, cold smile for the very first time that night. "Uncle R," she said, her voice dropping to a steady, freezing calm. "It's finally time for me to come home. And it's time Ethan Cross learns exactly who he just divorced." The following morning, the vicious media machine was already buzzing frantically. Entertainment blogs and gossip sites splashed massive, high-resolution photos of Ethan Cross and Sienna Vale stepping out of a sleek black town car at the Met Gala. Cameras flashed wildly around them as if they were actual royalty. The sensational headlines screamed across the internet. Tech CEO and supermodel make first public appearance, and Ethan Cross's new power couple era begins. Ava sat quietly at the small, wobbly breakfast table in her rented Brooklyn loft, an untouched cup of black coffee cooling rapidly in front of her. The city outside her window hummed loudly with its usual chaotic energy, but inside her head, there was only absolute, terrifying stillness. She had spent the entire, sleepless night meticulously making lists, painfully revisiting dark memories she'd deliberately buried, and constantly replaying Ethan's cruel final words like a broken record. "You don't have the power to fight me." The late-night call to Uncle Richard had been incredibly brief. He hadn't asked for any messy, emotional details. "I'll send the car," he'd said simply, his voice tight with protective anger. "Be ready by noon." Her simple, quiet life in the Brooklyn loft had been a highly deliberate, intentional choice. Bare, exposed brick walls mismatched, comfortable furniture she'd happily found at local flea markets, and wooden shelves heavily lined with worn books and her architectural design sketches. She had proudly built this humble life entirely herself, piece by piece. To be wonderfully ordinary, to be completely free from the crushing, suffocating expectations that always came with bearing the Sinclair name. Now, that quiet chapter of her life was permanently closing. She moved very slowly through the room, carefully folding her simple clothes into a single, worn leather suitcase. It wasn't really about keeping the cheap belongings. Most of these things could be easily replaced in a day with pocket change. It was entirely about the heavy symbolism of the moment. She was actively leaving behind her safe, comfortable anonymity, and stepping violently back into a cutthroat world where absolutely every move she made could dramatically shift global financial markets. At the cheap wooden dresser, her hand hesitated for a moment over a framed, happy photo of her and Ethan from their very first year together. They were smiling brightly on a sunny beach in Santorini, his strong arms wrapped lovingly around her waist. She stared at the lie for a second, then dropped the frame face down onto the wood and left it there to gather dust. When the massive, armored black Bentley arrived exactly at noon, the burly driver, an older, imposing man with sharp, observant eyes, took her cheap suitcase without a single word. "Miss Sinclair," he said respectfully, holding open the heavy door. It had been 5 long years since anyone had formally addressed her by her true, powerful surname in public. It felt exactly like a missing, heavy piece of herself sliding violently back into its rightful place. The smooth drive from the gritty city back to the sprawling Sinclair estate was long enough for the towering steel and glass of Manhattan to slowly fade into lush, sprawling, manicured green hills. Memories came flooding back in vivid, painful flashes. Her beautiful mother smiling in the vast rose garden, the booming echo of her powerful father's laughter in the marble halls, her own fierce teenage rebellion against the endless, fake charity events and stuffy investor dinners. By the time the car finally passed through the towering, wrought iron security gates deeply engraved with the gold Sinclair family crest, Ava's racing pulse had entirely shifted from cold dread to ironclad resolve. The main hall of the estate was exactly as grand as she remembered. Vast expanses of polished white marble, a sweeping, dramatic double staircase, and high walls lined with massive oil portraits of wealthy ancestors who looked as if they could step right out of the gold frames and harshly critique your posture. Uncle Richard waited patiently at the base of the grand stairs. Impeccably dressed, as always, in a sharp charcoal suit, he studied her pale, exhausted face for a long, heavy moment before stepping forward and pulling her into a surprisingly tight, warm hug. "You've lost far too much weight," he said, frowning deeply as he pulled back. "And you're 6 months along?" She nodded slowly, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. "It's Ethan's." His dark frown deepened dangerously, and his voice took on that specific, clipped, terrifying tone that had famously terrified grown CEOs in boardrooms across 3 continents. "Then come into the library and tell me absolutely everything." They moved into the massive library, a vast, intimidating room with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and a roaring fire crackling warmly in the massive stone hearth despite the mild spring day outside. Ava sat in a leather armchair and told him the entire, pathetic story from the very beginning. How she had naively met Ethan under her assumed, fake name. How she'd intentionally kept her true identity a total secret, and how he'd callously, brutally thrown her aside into the trash for Sienna Vale to boost his stock price. Richard listened intently without interrupting once, his handsome expression completely unreadable and made of stone. When she finally finished speaking, he leaned heavily back in his leather chair, steepling his long fingers together thoughtfully. "He genuinely thinks you're completely powerless," Richard said, a dark, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. "That's very good for us. Let him keep thinking that for just a little longer." It was a brilliant, strategic pause. Ava had fully expected him to suggest immediate, explosive retaliation, loud press releases, massive lawsuits, a very public, aggressive display of Sinclair wealth and influence to crush Ethan instantly. Instead, Richard calmly poured her a glass of sparkling water and handed it to her. "We don't start this war with petty revenge, Ava," he said softly. "We start with total control." "Control of what exactly?" she asked, taking the glass. "Control of the global narrative," he replied smoothly. "Right now, the public story is entirely about Ethan and his shiny new model. We need to make absolutely sure that you become the only story, and completely on our terms." Ava took a slow, calming sip of the cold water. "I don't want the public's sympathy, Richard." "You won't get sympathy," Richard said, his eyes flashing with pride. "You'll get their absolute respect." The very first step of the plan happened that afternoon. Ava's cheap, outdated cell phone was immediately replaced with a brand new, highly secure device, preloaded with encrypted apps and elite contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Powerful board members, ruthless legal advisors, and top-tier PR strategists. Her entire wardrobe was aggressively replaced, too. Gone forever were the casual, cheap dresses and worn, comfortable cardigans. They were instantly replaced by sleek, intimidating, custom-tailored silhouettes in bold, commanding colors. Ava stood silently before a massive, full-length mirror in a severely fitted, black designer dress and priceless pearl earrings, her dark hair swept flawlessly into a tight, low chignon. She didn't look anything like the sad, pathetic woman Ethan had just walked out on. She looked exactly like the terrifying, powerful daughter of Elizabeth Sinclair. Her uncle's senior assistant entered the room holding a glowing tablet. "The media is still heavily covering Ethan and Sienna's Met Gala appearance, but we can easily shift the focus. There's a massive, global tech summit happening in 2 days. If you attend it publicly, it will immediately set off massive questions in the press." Ava smiled a very faint, freezing cold smile. "Questions are good. Let them wonder." Across the city, in his sprawling, sterile penthouse, Ethan was currently basking in the glorious, blinding attention. Sienna laughed loudly, tossing her hair at his practiced jokes during a televised morning interview, her manicured hand resting lightly and possessively on his arm as the sycophantic host gushed endlessly about their incredible, undeniable chemistry. Behind the scenes, however, Ethan's stressed PR team was working exhausting overtime to desperately spin the sudden divorce as a completely mutual, amicable decision. But dangerous cracks were already forming in the facade. Major investors had begun whispering quietly in back rooms about his erratic judgment, deeply concerned that messy personal drama could negatively affect the company's pristine image right before a major launch. Ethan confidently brushed the concerns off. Ava didn't have the money, the connections, or the legal resources to ever challenge him. He was absolutely sure of it. Back at the sprawling Sinclair estate, Ava walked slowly through the massive, blooming rose garden where her mother used to spend quiet mornings before stressful board meetings. She felt the baby move, a small, insistent, physical reminder of exactly why she couldn't afford to falter or show weakness now. This wasn't just about her bruised pride or petty revenge anymore. It was entirely about securing an ironclad future for her child, one that wasn't permanently tainted by Ethan's disgusting arrogance. She stopped by the large stone fountain at the very center of the garden, listening to the calming sound of water mingling with the rustle of the trees. She could almost hear her brilliant mother's voice echoing in the wind. "True strength isn't loud, Ava. It's steady." Her encrypted phone buzzed in her pocket with a short message from Richard. "Be in the main boardroom at 9 a.m. sharp tomorrow. You're going to like this." The very next morning, she stepped confidently into the massive Sinclair Technologies boardroom for the first time in 5 years. Every single executive head turned sharply as she entered, not just because of her striking, powerful presence, but because of the empty, massive leather chair sitting at the very head of the long table. Richard gestured grandly toward it. "It's yours now, Ava." Effective immediately. The soft Italian leather of the chair was cool beneath her fingertips. Ava had sat quietly in many small, boring meeting rooms before, but she had never sat at the absolute head of this specific table. The Sinclair Technologies boardroom was a terrifying empire in itself. It was a massive, intimidating oval of polished, solid walnut entirely surrounded by bulletproof windows that offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the entire city skyline. On the wood-paneled walls, framed original patents and massive global innovation awards told the undeniable story of a powerful dynasty that had literally changed the modern world. She took her seat slowly. The quiet in the massive room was incredibly thick. Every single wealthy board member was watching her closely, acting as though they'd just witnessed a massive, seismic shift in the Earth's crust. Uncle Richard stood proudly at her right side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his booming voice a perfect, terrifying blend of authority and pride. "Allow me to formally reintroduce Ava Sinclair, not merely as my niece, but as your brand new chairwoman." A loud ripple of shocked murmurs passed quickly around the table. Some older faces lit up with deep recognition and relief. Others, particularly the arrogant men who had only joined the board during Ava's long, self-imposed absence, looked deeply puzzled and slightly hostile. "She is back to stay permanently," Richard continued smoothly, "and she holds full majority voting power, effective immediately." A massive legacy was now fully resting in her hands. Ava folded her hands calmly on the polished table. "Thank you, Uncle Richard, and thank you to the board for trusting me with exactly what my brilliant mother built." Her voice was perfectly steady, even though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm. "I left this company years ago because I desperately needed to understand exactly who I was without. This massive name. Now I fully know. And I am here today because there is a massive amount of work to be done." The very first agenda item she brought up wasn't explicitly about Ethan, but he was already deeply woven into her strategic thoughts. Sinclair Technologies possessed the staggering financial resources to completely move global markets, and in the right, capable hands, it could also completely shift the delicate balance of power in an industry Ethan completely depended on to survive. "Before we move on to quarterly projections," Ava said, scanning the silent room with hawk-like intensity, "I want a full, comprehensive report on all of our current operational partnerships. especially any contracts involving cross dynamics. That definitely got their full attention. Several senior board members exchanged very wary, nervous glances. By the time lunch was served in the executive dining room, Ava had rapidly learned the brutal basics of the situation. Cross Dynamics had just recently, proudly secured a massive joint development agreement with a smaller, innovative AI firm, one that Sinclair Technologies had quietly and heavily invested in over 5 years ago. Ethan arrogantly thought he was brilliantly expanding his company into predictive analytics. He had absolutely no idea that Sinclair held total majority control over all the critical patents involved in the deal. Richard smirked a highly dangerous smirk when she pointed the glaring loophole out on the spreadsheet. So, what exactly do you want to do about it? Absolutely nothing, Ava said, leaning back comfortably in her leather chair, sipping her water. Not yet. We let him happily build it. We let him foolishly spend millions of his own dollars, aggressively marketing the new product to the public. And then, we legally call in our patent rights and crush it. Richard laughed softly. A terrifying sound. Cold. I absolutely like it. Meanwhile, blissfully unaware in his own shallow world, Ethan was riding incredibly high on his latest glowing press feature, tech's newest power couple, Ethan Cross and Sienna Vale. The fawning article heavily praised his visionary, unmatched leadership and Sienna's magnetic brand appeal, painting them to the public as completely unstoppable. He arrogantly forwarded the article link to his head of PR with a demanding note. This is the exact energy I want pushed everywhere. Make it happen. But there was a highly urgent email he didn't even bother to notice sitting in his inbox. One from his panicked CFO, desperately warning him that an upcoming, critical payment to their new AI partner was being mysteriously delayed for a contractual legal review. It was the very first subtle tremor of the massive earthquake Ava was planning. 2 days later, Ava made her highly anticipated first public appearance in over a year at the massive annual International Tech Summit. Blinding cameras flashed aggressively as she stepped gracefully out of the black Bentley. The simple, striking elegance of her navy-sheath dress made just as much of a powerful statement as the incredibly discreet, priceless diamond earrings she wore. Ravenous journalists immediately swarmed the barricades. Miss Sinclair, are you here to announce a massive new partnership? Why return now, after so much time away from the public eye? Is it true you're currently pregnant? Ava just smiled a cryptic, mysterious smile, offering absolutely no comment beyond. I'm simply here for the future. Inside the massive convention center, she worked the room with cold, calculated precision. Every single handshake was photographed by the press. Every brief conversation was noted by industry bloggers. By the time she finally reached the massive Sinclair Technologies booth, social media was already absolutely ablaze with viral photos and trending headlines. Ava Sinclair, missing heiress, returns to the game. How will competitors react? That exact night, Ethan sat on the couch in his penthouse, scrolling obsessively through his news feeds on his iPad. Sienna was lounging on the couch beside him, lazily sipping expensive champagne. Who's Ava Sinclair? She asked casually, looking over his shoulder at the screen. Ethan froze completely, his blood running cold. No one you need to worry about, he snapped. But his stomach tightened painfully. He definitely knew the powerful name. He'd heard it spoken in passing at elite conferences for years, always with a certain, terrified reverence. He had never, not once, connected it to the quiet, self-contained, unassuming woman he'd married and discarded. She looks like she really means business, Sienna said, tapping a manicured nail on the screen. And hey, isn't that your new AI partner she's talking to in this photo? Ethan's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Coincidence? He told himself desperately. but it absolutely didn't feel like one. Back at the sprawling Sinclair estate, Ava sat quietly in her private study, meticulously reviewing complex legal documents that perfectly outlined every single weak point in Ethan's entire business structure. Her massive legal team was already aggressively drafting ironclad contingency plans for seizing all patent rights if necessary. It wasn't just about hitting him financially anymore. It was about totally dismantling the fake, arrogant myth he had built around himself. In his shallow world, public image was the only currency that mattered, and she was about to bankrupt him in both. Richard entered the study carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You've definitely caused a massive stir," he said, handing her a cold glass. "Half the tech industry is desperately wondering why you're back. The other half is terrified guessing what you'll do next." Ava took a slow sip. "Good. I want him to feel the walls closing in on him before they actually crush him." A week later, Ethan's stressed CFO walked hurriedly into his glass office looking incredibly grim. "We've got a massive problem. Ethan, the new AI partner you signed with, their controlling shareholder has just legally called for a total renegotiation of the contract." "And who exactly is that shareholder?" Ethan demanded. The CFO swallowed hard. "It's Sinclair Technologies." Ethan's blood ran ice cold. "Sinclair?" "Yes, sir. And from what I hear through the grapevine, Ava Sinclair is personally calling all the shots over there now." The horrific realization hit him like a physical punch to the gut. The puzzle pieces suddenly, violently clicked into place. The matching last name, her sudden, flashy public reappearance, the chilling, calculated calm she'd shown when he'd cruelly left her in the penthouse. "She completely played me," he muttered, more to himself than to the terrified CFO. That night, in a blind panic, Ethan called Ava's number. She didn't answer. He aggressively tried again, straight to voicemail. He sent a short, desperate text, "We really need to talk." No reply. In the quiet peace of her study, Ava read the pathetic message and set her phone aside face down. Let him sweat. She absolutely wasn't ready to speak to him until the entire boardroom and the media cameras were watching. 3 agonizing days later, an invitation arrived by courier at Ethan's office. It was golden embossed, heavily bearing the terrifying Sinclair Technologies seal. It was an exclusive invitation for a special joint industry announcement to be held in the Grand Ballroom at the Grand Manhattan Hotel. At the very bottom, written in elegant script, was a single devastating line, hosted by Ava Sinclair, chairwoman. The Grand Manhattan Hotel had famously hosted sitting presidents, royal weddings, and billion-dollar merger signings, but that specific morning, the entire building belonged to Ava Sinclair. The massive marble lobby gleamed brightly under crystal chandeliers, and a long, red-carpeted staircase led directly to the ballroom, where the highly anticipated press conference would take place. Rows of plush velvet chairs faced a long, elevated stage draped heavily in Sinclair Technologies' signature navy and silver banners. Dozens of camera crews were already frantically setting up their equipment when Ava arrived, escorted by Richard and 2 of the company's most senior, intimidating executives. Her powerful presence was electric. Journalists craned their necks eagerly, camera flashes popped blindingly, and the low, excited hum of pure speculation filled the tense air. Ethan Cross was nowhere to be seen yet. Backstage in the green room, Ava calmly reviewed her notes, though she already knew the devastating speech by heart. This wasn't just a boring industry announcement. This was the highly calculated, very first public move in her complete dismantling of Ethan's fragile empire. The timing, the public optics, the massive stakes, absolutely everything had been engineered flawlessly to ensure maximum, destructive impact. Richard leaned in close. "Remember, we're not just here to publicly humiliate him. We're here to permanently shift the market's entire confidence." Ava gave him a look that was both deeply amused and terrifyingly icy. "The market will absolutely get the message loud and clear, and so will he." 15 minutes before the massive event began, Ethan finally strode into the ballroom with Sienna clinging to his arm. Both were dressed extravagantly, exactly as if they were arriving for a glossy magazine cover shoot. His navy suit was immaculate, his expensive cufflinks catching the stage light. Sienna's tight, white silk dress was cut to perfection. Cameras swiveled toward them instantly, reporters loudly calling out questions about their power couple status. Ethan smiled his fake, practiced smile for the flashbulbs. But when his panicked gaze finally found Ava standing confidently across the room, his expression shifted violently, just for a second, from smug arrogance to absolute terror. She didn't look away from him. The MC, a highly respected, well-known business journalist, stepped up to the podium to open the event. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today for this very special, unprecedented joint industry announcement. Today marks a massive, strategic partnership between Sinclair Technologies and, he paused for dramatic effect, Cross Dynamics. A loud buzz of shock rippled rapidly through the audience. Ethan had clearly, foolishly expected to somehow control the narrative today. But Ava had masterfully forced him onto her stage, entirely under her ruthless rules. Ava walked forward to the stage, every single step deliberate and powerful, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She confidently took her place at the podium, right beside a sweating Ethan. Their close proximity provided a picture-perfect, smiling photo op for everyone in the room, except for him. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice carrying easily and authoritatively over the silent room. "As many of you already know, Sinclair Technologies has a very long, proud history of true innovation and strategic, sustainable growth. Today, we are aggressively expanding that legacy with a joint venture that will absolutely revolutionize predictive analytics globally." She turned slightly toward Ethan, her smile perfectly, terrifyingly poised. "Cross Dynamics will be our operational partner, working entirely under the umbrella of Sinclair Technologies' massive patent portfolio. Together, we aim to bring advanced forecasting tools to markets worldwide." The specific phrasing she used was subtle to outsiders, but utterly devastating to insiders. Under the umbrella was harsh corporate language for exactly who held all the real power. The wealthy investors in the room understood the dynamic instantly. Ethan's jaw tightened so hard he thought his teeth might crack. A hand shot up from the audience during the Q&A. It belonged to a prominent, ruthless venture capitalist known for backing aggressive tech plays. "Miss Sinclair, could you please clarify for us? Will Sinclair Technologies hold the controlling interest in this partnership?" "Yes, absolutely," Ava said smoothly, without missing a beat. "Sinclair retains total majority ownership of all the intellectual property and product rights. Cross Dynamics will simply manage the basic implementation, under our strict strategic guidance." Loud gasps and murmurs filled the ballroom. Ethan's face was a frozen mask of pure rage, but his knuckles went stark white as he gripped the edges of the podium. As Ava expertly fielded more questions, Sienna whispered something to Ethan, her voice loud enough for a few nearby, eager reporters to hear clearly. "I thought you told me you had full control over this company." The humiliating words spread like wildfire among the press corps, their pens scribbling furiously on notepads. Cameras zoomed in aggressively on Ethan's reaction, a violent flicker of intense irritation that he desperately tried to disguise as a loving smile for her. Ava caught the miserable exchange and tucked it safely away for later. By the time the press conference finally ended, headlines were already flooding global news sites. "Sinclair Technologies dominates new partnership. Cross Dynamics cedes total control in predictive analytics deal." The stock market tickers immediately reflected the massive shift in power. Sinclair shares climbed a solid 4% before noon. Cross Dynamics stock dipped dangerously by nearly 3%. It wasn't completely catastrophic yet, but it was a massive, highly public crack in Ethan's impenetrable armor. As the wealthy guests began to disperse from the ballroom, Ethan angrily caught up to Ava near the private side exit. "What the hell are you trying to do?" he hissed furiously under his breath, looking around. "Just business," she said lightly, stepping gracefully past him. "You completely blindsided me," he pressed, grabbing her arm. "You could have negotiated this privately." "I did negotiate," she cut in sharply, yanking her arm away and turning to face him fully. "You just simply weren't invited to sit at the adults' table." His eyes narrowed into angry slits. "This isn't over, Ava." She smiled faintly. "No, Ethan. It's just beginning." Back at the sprawling estate that evening, Ava sat comfortably in her study, drinking tea and watching the news replay of the conference on a muted screen. She studied Ethan's terrified face frame by frame. She analyzed the small, pathetic giveaways in his stiff posture, the brief moments where his arrogant mask slipped to reveal his panic. She wanted him constantly on edge, desperately second-guessing every single move he made. Richard entered the room holding a thick folder. "We've got even more leverage now. Cross Dynamics has 2 major, vital supply contracts expiring next quarter. Guess who secretly owns those suppliers?" Ava didn't even need to guess. "Perfect. We'll aggressively renegotiate the terms entirely in our favor." At his penthouse, Ethan was frantically screaming on the phone with his legal team. "Find me a way to legally challenge their majority control. Anything." "Legally, they're completely airtight, Ethan," his exhausted lawyer replied over speakerphone. "They've owned these specific patents for years. You walked blindly straight into this one." Ethan aggressively ended the call and poured himself a heavy drink. He had severely, fatally underestimated her. And now she was brilliantly using the one arena he absolutely couldn't dominate with fake charm or flashy press photos, the ruthless boardroom. 3 agonizing days later, Ethan received a formal legal summons. Not to a civil court, but to a highly unexpected, emergency shareholder meeting at Cross Dynamics. The attached agenda had just 3 terrifying words printed on it: vote of confidence. The Cross Dynamics boardroom was usually a safe place where Ethan confidently commanded the floor. Today, it felt exactly like walking into enemy territory. The air was incredibly tight with thick tension. The polished oak tables were entirely surrounded by angry shareholders whose facial expressions ranged from politely curious to openly, aggressively hostile. The vote of confidence agenda item loomed ominously on the printed packets resting in front of every single seat. Ethan adjusted his expensive tie and forced a confident, fake smile. "Good morning, everyone. I know there's been some chatter after the Sinclair announcement, but let me assure you, our partnership is incredibly strong, and our leadership team is intensely focused on growth." A few polite nods. Absolutely no applause. The very first question came from Harold Drake, a powerful, long-time investor with a fearsome reputation for being brutally blunt. "Ethan, why exactly were the shareholders not informed that Sinclair Technologies held absolute majority control over the predictive analytics project before the deal was signed?" Ethan's jaw tightened defensively. "Because that specific, minor detail doesn't affect our ability to execute the rollout. It absolutely affects our leverage." Harold cut in aggressively, slamming his hand on the table. "It affects our company's valuation. It affects everything." The angry murmurs around the table grew significantly louder. Ethan felt the power shift violently away from him. He wasn't controlling the narrative here at all. As the furious questions piled on, Ethan realized the terrifying, unspoken truth. Ava wasn't even physically in the room, but her massive presence was absolutely everywhere. Her name came up 3 times in the first 20 minutes, always spoken with deep respect, always with the heavy implication that she'd brilliantly outmaneuvered him. "Mr. Cross," another angry shareholder asked loudly, "has Miss Sinclair expressed any intent to acquire a larger, controlling stake in Cross Dynamics?" Ethan kept his tone incredibly even, though he was sweating. "Not to me. which was technically true. But the truth simply didn't matter when the volatile market believed otherwise. Halfway through the disastrous meeting, the heavy double doors at the back of the room opened. A woman dressed in a severely tailored charcoal suit stepped confidently inside, her heels silent against the plush carpet. Every single head turned. It was Ava. She didn't speak at first. She just calmly handed a sealed, thick envelope to the board secretary. "These are critical documents for your immediate review," she said, her voice carrying easily and powerfully in the stunned silence. Ethan's pulse spiked to dangerous levels. "What is this?" "Just a professional courtesy," Ava replied smoothly, looking right through him. "So absolutely no one can say they weren't fully informed." The documents inside the envelope contained a formal legal notice. Sinclair Technologies had quietly, aggressively acquired a staggering 12% stake in Cross Dynamics over the past quarter through a complex series of hidden shell companies. Combined securely with friendly, allied shareholders who were already aligned with Sinclair, Ava effectively controlled nearly a third of the total voting power in the room. The impact was instantaneous and explosive. Chairs shifted violently. Angry side conversations erupted. Ethan's CFO looked exactly like he'd swallowed a lemon. "This is absolutely not a hostile takeover," Ava said, her tone almost gentle but laced with poison. "It's a strategic partnership, but I firmly believe partnerships work best when there's absolute transparency and capable, trustworthy leadership." The brutal implication landed on Ethan like a sledgehammer. The vote of confidence was called much sooner than expected. Ethan made his desperate case in a tight, clipped, sweating speech, but the momentum was entirely gone. The numbers were incredibly close, but he survived barely. Just enough conservative shareholders still believed that replacing him right now would cause slightly more instability than keeping him in place. When the tense meeting adjourned, Ethan practically stalked toward Ava in the hallway. "You came here just to publicly humiliate me?" "No," she said coldly. "I came here to warn them." "Warn them about what?" he demanded, his face red. She smiled a faint, chilling smile. "About the massive storms they don't see coming." That night, in a desperate bid for survival, Ethan called in every favor he had left in the city. If Ava arrogantly thought she could quietly box him in with boardroom maneuvers, he would drag the battle kicking and screaming into the public arena. He aggressively arranged an exclusive, prime-time interview with a major business television network, desperately framing the massive Sinclair stake as a friendly, welcome collaboration and heavily downplaying any rumors of conflict. "Cross Dynamics is incredibly strong," he confidently told the cameras, smiling his best fake smile. "And I have absolutely no doubt our partnership with Sinclair will drive unprecedented innovation in the sector." But the exact second the segment aired, Ava's brilliant PR team released a devastating statement of their own. Sinclair Technologies is fully committed to supporting Cross Dynamics' growth, under leadership that prioritizes ultimate transparency and strategic foresight. It was a perfect, brutal mirror, polite, professional, and utterly devastating to his credibility. Back at the Sinclair estate, Ava calmly reviewed a detailed list of Ethan's upcoming speaking engagements, corporate partnerships, and elite investor dinners. "Every single event he attends," she told Richard, pointing at the schedule, "we will have a highly visible presence there, not to confront him directly, just to remind people that I am always watching." Richard smirked, highly impressed. "You're making him fight invisible shadows." "Exactly," she said coldly. "Shadows are impossible to hit." Sienna, meanwhile, wasn't used to being ignored. But lately, Ethan was completely distracted, constantly tense, and always angrily yelling on the phone late into the night. The lavish, romantic dates had slowed to a halt, completely replaced by frantic strategy meetings and panicked emergency calls. One evening, she furiously confronted him in the penthouse. "This isn't fun for me anymore. Ethan, you're completely obsessed with her." "I'm not obsessed," he snapped violently, throwing his glass. "I'm managing a highly complex situation." Sienna folded her arms, glaring at him. Managing it? Or losing it? A week later, extremely exclusive invitations went out for the Sinclair Foundation's massive annual charity gala, a highly publicized black tie event that essentially doubled as a flex of the family's immense global influence. Ava had intentionally skipped it for years. This time, her powerful name was boldly printed at the very top of the host list. The guest list read like a who's who of the absolute global business and political elite. Ethan and Sienna were both formally invited, though Ava highly doubted they'd dare decline and look weak. Richard caught her eye as they reviewed the massive seating chart. "You're setting a very public stage, Ava." Ava's smile was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. "I'm not just setting a stage, Richard. I'm building a theater." On the night of the spectacular gala, the red carpet was an absolute blaze of blinding flashbulbs. Ava stepped gracefully out of the Bentley in a sweeping, breathtaking black gown, priceless diamonds catching the light like shards of ice. The cameras roared her name, and at the far end of the carpet, she saw Ethan and Sienna arrive just as the ravenous press shouted, "Ava, over here with them for a photo." The Sinclair Foundation's annual charity gala was the absolute crown jewel of the city's elite social calendar. A glittering, ostentatious evening where billionaires, politicians, and A-list celebrities mingled freely under the polite pretense of philanthropy. Tonight, however, it was infinitely more than a fundraiser. It was Ava Sinclair's personal battlefield. The grand ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel shimmered brilliantly under massive chandeliers the size of small cars. Crystal flutes of expensive champagne sparkled beautifully on silver trays, and the air was incredibly thick with the heady scent of thousands of fresh orchids flown in privately from Singapore. A massive, 40-foot digital display cycled endlessly through powerful images of Sinclair-funded global projects. New schools, high-tech hospitals, massive tech incubators. But absolutely no one was looking at the screen. All eyes were completely on Ava. She moved effortlessly through the massive crowd with the absolute grace of someone who was born to command it. Her black silk gown flowed around her like liquid night, and the deep V of the elegant neckline was perfectly offset by the flawless drape of a multi-million-dollar diamond necklace. She warmly greeted massive donors, shook hands confidently with state senators, and posed flawlessly for photographs. Every single time the cameras flashed, Ethan saw it. She absolutely wasn't the quiet, modest, compliant woman he'd left. She was a massive, magnetic, untouchable presence. Sienna clung desperately to his arm as they stepped into the room, her silver dress catching the light. But while heads turned briefly to acknowledge them, the rabid photographers weren't shouting their names. They were only shouting Ava's. It didn't take long for them to finally cross paths. Ava was speaking intimately with the city's mayor when Ethan aggressively approached, with Sienna awkwardly in tow. "Madam Chairwoman," Ethan said with a fake, practiced smile. "Impressive turnout tonight." Ava's gaze flicked to him, freezing cool and entirely unreadable. "We have incredibly generous supporters. They firmly believe in causes that actually matter." Sienna forced a high-pitched, nervous laugh. "Like helping? Whatever it is your foundation actually does." The mayor's bushy eyebrows rose in shock at the stupidity. Ava's polite smile never faltered for a second. "Education, global healthcare, and sustainable innovation," she said smoothly. "Things that leave a profound, lasting impact on the world, unlike a seasonal, shallow runway show." The mayor chuckled under his breath and quickly excused himself. Dinner was served at long, elegant banquet tables arranged in a massive horseshoe around the main stage. Ava had deliberately, strategically placed Ethan and Sienna at a prime VIP table near the front, but located directly across from her own seat. It was highly deliberate. Every single time he looked up from his plate, she was there, poised, powerful, and engaged with the city's most influential, wealthy people. Midway through the meal, the MC announced a very special guest speaker, Ava Sinclair herself. Ethan stiffened in his chair. He hadn't been warned about this. Ava stepped confidently to the podium, her voice carrying easily and beautifully through the massive hall. She spoke passionately about the Foundation's projects, the countless lives changed, and the vital importance of innovation, not just in corporate business, but in human compassion. Then, her tone shifted slightly. Partnerships, she said, her voice echoing, are built entirely on absolute trust, total transparency, and mutual respect. Without those three pillars, even the most promising, brilliant ventures can falter and fail. I've learned that difficult lesson the hard way recently, but I've also learned exactly how to rebuild infinitely stronger than before. It wasn't an overt, screaming attack, but it absolutely didn't need to be. The intelligent room caught the brutal subtext immediately. Cameras zoomed in tight on Ethan's furious, red face. As massive applause filled the room, Sienna leaned in toward Ethan. "You didn't tell me she was this incredibly good at this," she hissed. Her voice wasn't extremely loud, but it was loud enough for the powerful venture capitalist sitting right beside her to hear clearly. That specific VC happened to be a very close Sinclair ally. Within minutes, the damaging comment made its way back to Ava via a discreet, encrypted text from Richard. She's rattled him in front of his biggest donors. Ava allowed herself a small, victorious sip of champagne, her expression totally unreadable. After dinner, wealthy guests wandered over to the silent auction tables. Luxury vacations, priceless art pieces, rare vintage wines. Ava had personally donated a week long. All expenses paid, retreat at the massive Sinclair estate in Provence, complete with private jet transportation. Ethan's petty, competitive streak flared uncontrollably when he saw it. He aggressively scribbled his massive bid, fiercely determined to win at least one headline-worthy prize tonight to save his ego. An hour later, the final, winning bids were revealed on the screen. Ethan's name was there, but listed right below Ava's, who had brilliantly outbid him by a single, solitary dollar, aggressively reclaiming her own donation just for the publicity and total control. It was incredibly petty. It was absolutely perfect. The live band struck up a slow, romantic jazz number, and wealthy couples began to fill the massive dance floor. Ava gracefully accepted a dance from the governor, her bright laughter ringing clear across the room. Photographers swarmed them. Ethan, watching furiously from the edge of the floor, could feel the entire media narrative slipping completely out of his hands. He'd come here expecting to arrogantly show unity and charm with Sienna. Instead, the entire evening belonged totally and completely to Ava. Sienna tugged desperately at his sleeve. "Dance with me," she whispered, deep desperation edging her voice. He obliged stiffly, but halfway through the song, Ava and the governor danced smoothly past them. Ava caught Ethan's angry eye just long enough to make him stumble and miss a step. As the incredible night drew to a close, Ava took the microphone once more to thank the guests. "Tonight, we've successfully raised over $14 million for vital initiatives that will shape the future," she announced to thunderous, standing applause. Then, with a subtle, chilling glance toward Ethan, she added, "And in the coming months, Sinclair Technologies will unveil massive new projects that completely redefine what's possible when leadership is finally aligned with true purpose." It was a bold announcement with absolutely no specifics, but it landed on Ethan like a warning shot from a cannon. The message was incredibly clear. Bigger, more destructive moves were coming for him. In the private green room after the gala, Richard handed an exhausted Ava a glass of water. "You just completely owned that entire room." "That was exactly the point," she said, carefully removing her heavy diamond earrings. He desperately needed to see that no matter where we are, I completely control the tone, and everyone else in the industry needs to see it, too. Her secure phone buzzed. A message from one of Ethan's most powerful minority shareholders. If you're truly serious about making a change in leadership at Cross Dynamics, I'm fully ready to talk tomorrow. Ava's smile was incredibly slow and totally deliberate. It's starting. An hour later, while the rest of the city slept, a secure courier delivered a thick, heavy envelope directly to the Sinclair estate. Inside was a highly confidential legal document marked in bold red ink, Acquisition Proposal, Cross Dynamics. And at the very bottom, the massive offer was signed not by Ava, but by 3 of Ethan's very own, previously loyal board members. The envelope sat on Ava's mahogany desk like a loaded weapon. 3 Cross Dynamics board members, men who had once stood firmly and loudly in Ethan's corner, were now practically begging her, offering her a clear, legal path to controlling his entire company outright. Richard read the shocking proposal twice, then looked up at her in disbelief. They're dead serious. They've completely had enough of him and his scandals. Ava slowly traced a finger along the embossed Sinclair letterhead she'd been using for recent communications. If they're coming directly to me like this, it means he's losing significantly more than just market confidence. He's actively losing his own people. Across the city, Ethan was in total, frantic damage control mode. His miserable days were an endless blur of screaming investor calls, panicked emergency strategy meetings, and frantic texts to angry board members. Each conversation felt like it ended with the exact same, polite but freezing distant promise. We'll see how the next quarter goes, Ethan. Sienna noticed the massive shift. Their romantic, lavish dinners had turned into tense, silent meals. The expensive, luxury trips he'd once promised her were abruptly postponed indefinitely. Her patience was wearing incredibly thin. One evening, she finally confronted him. Ethan, you're obviously losing this fight. He didn't even look up from his laptop screen. I'm managing it. Managing what? She pressed angrily. Ava's face is absolutely everywhere. On the news, at the elite events. In your own contracts. She's actively making you look like a total fool in public. Ethan's jaw tightened until it hurt. Then it's finally time we aggressively change the game. At the Sinclair estate, Ava gathered her trusted inner circle. Richard, her top PR head, her ruthless chief legal counsel, and a senior representative from their aggressive mergers and acquisitions team. The acquisition proposal was projected brightly onto the wall. The offer is extremely solid, the M&A rep explained confidently. If we match it with our available Sinclair capital, we'd easily have controlling interest in Cross Dynamics within 3 weeks. Ava's expression was totally calm, but her brilliant mind was sharp with cold calculation. I'm not interested in just forcefully taking his company away from him. I want him to actively choose to give it up. Richard raised a skeptical eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan to make an arrogant man do that? She leaned back in her leather chair. By making absolutely every single day he stays in charge exponentially more painful than leaving. The very next week, Sinclair Technologies proudly announced a massive, groundbreaking new research initiative in predictive AI, one that directly, aggressively competed with Ethan's prized flagship project. The press release brilliantly framed it as building upon our existing patents, a very subtle, public reminder to the market that Sinclair completely owned the technology's foundation. Investors noticed immediately. Top financial analysts began loudly questioning Cross Dynamics' long-term viability on major cable news segments. Stock prices wavered dangerously. Ethan's panicked CFO burst into his office with a grim update. We just lost 2 major institutional investors today. They're entirely shifting their capital over to Sinclair. Ethan violently slammed his pen on the desk. Who? The CFO hesitated, sweating. One of them was your biggest board ally until last week. Sienna, meanwhile, began to feel entirely like acceptable collateral damage in a brutal war she hadn't signed up for. She'd gone rapidly from being the glamorous, celebrated new chapter in Ethan's life to a boring, ignored background accessory in his increasingly frantic, failing schedule. At a fancy dinner with friends, she clearly overheard someone whisper she really traded for the wrong stock. Cruel laughter followed. That night, she asked Ethan point blank, "If she takes your company away from you, what happens to us?" He stared at her blankly for a long moment before answering. "She won't take it," but his hollow voice lacked any real conviction. Late one evening, Ava's secure phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered, and to her immense surprise, it was Sienna. "I'm absolutely not calling to be your friend," Sienna said quickly, without preamble. "But I really think you should know. Ethan's planning something big. He's meeting secretly with a massive private equity group next week. He's going to desperately try to raise enough capital to block your takeover." Ava kept her voice perfectly neutral. "And why exactly are you telling me this?" "Because if he ultimately loses, I absolutely do not want to be standing anywhere near him when it happens," Sienna replied coldly. "And because I know you're going to win anyway." The very next day, Ava's ruthless legal counsel secured emergency backroom meetings with two of the absolute largest private equity firms in the country, both with very long, highly profitable histories of working closely with Sinclair Technologies. By the end of the week, those powerful firms had publicly, loudly declared their total financial support for Sinclair's vision for industry innovation, effectively, brutally cutting off Ethan's only lifeline before he could even reach for it. Richard grinned like a shark as the news broke on TV. "You didn't just politely close a door on him, Ava. You bricked it completely shut." Ava allowed herself a very small, satisfied smile. "Now we just wait for him to fully realize he's running out of exits." When Ethan heard the devastating news, he went completely quiet. Too quiet. His terrified COO watched him closely during their next emergency meeting. "Ethan, we desperately need to start contingency planning if Sinclair decides to push for a hostile takeover." "There absolutely won't be a hostile takeover," Ethan interrupted, his eyes wild. "Because I'm not giving her the satisfaction of beating me." But that night, completely alone in his dark penthouse, he stared out at the glowing city lights and felt the walls rapidly closing in on him. Every single option was narrowing. Every desperate call with the angry board was significantly colder than the last. 2 agonizing days later, Ethan received a thick envelope delivered by hand. Inside was a simple, handwritten note on heavy cardstock. "Dinner. Neutral ground. Just us. Ava." The location listed was an incredibly private, VIP dining room at the absolute top of the St. Regis Hotel. No media, no angry board members, just them. Ethan stared at the simple note for a very long time before tucking it securely into his jacket pocket. That evening, he arrived nervously at the St. Regis to find Ava already peacefully seated at a candlelit table by the massive window, the glittering skyline sprawling magnificently behind her. She looked entirely calm, almost serene, as she gently set down her wine glass. "Ethan," she said, her voice as smooth as silk, "let's finally talk about the exact price of your piece." The exclusive St. Regis dining room was nearly empty, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the vast city like a living, breathing painting. Soft jazz drifted quietly from hidden speakers, the low light glinting beautifully off polished silverware. Ava sat perfectly poised, her hands resting lightly on the table, a breathtaking vision of absolute, calm control. Ethan approached the table, his jaw incredibly tight, his expression aggressively neutral. He took the seat directly across from her, without offering to shake her hand. "You picked a nice spot for a surrender," he said flatly, trying to retain some power. "I wanted privacy," Ava replied smoothly. An absolute clarity. A waiter appeared instantly with a bottle of expensive wine, but neither of them touched it. This was absolutely not a dinner for indulgence. It was a high-stakes negotiation. Ethan leaned aggressively forward. If you're just here to gloat about the stock, save it. I'm still in total control of cross dynamics. For now, Ava said evenly, sipping her water. But every single day you fight me, you lose more ground. Your board is completely fractured. Your biggest investors are desperately looking elsewhere. And you know perfectly well that I have the infinite resources to wait you out forever. He gave a harsh, humorless laugh. You always did like playing the long game. I learned how to be ruthless from the best, she said. Her tone soft but edged with deadly steel. Ava smoothly slid a thick manila folder across the table. Inside was a legal document, clearly labeled Proposed Transition Agreement. I'm offering you a clean way out of this, she said. You will resign as CEO publicly, citing personal reasons. In exchange for your peaceful exit, Sinclair Technologies acquires Cross Dynamics at a slight premium that protects your fragile reputation and the value of your remaining shares. You walk away with enough money to start over quietly somewhere else. Ethan's eyes scanned the legal pages rapidly. This is surprisingly generous, he said finally, narrowing his eyes. Far too generous. Which means you obviously want something more from me. What is it? What I want, Ava said, her voice dropping to a whisper, is to end this pathetic war on my exact terms, and not drag my child's name through court in the press. Ethan closed the folder and pushed it aggressively aside. You think you can just buy my dignity with a check? I think, Ava said slowly, holding his gaze, that you've already sold your dignity to the media, to your massive ego, and to anyone who actually believed your pathetic story about trading up for a model and leaving your powerless wife behind. His jaw tightened. This isn't about our failed marriage anymore. Ava's eyes locked fiercely onto his. It has always been about the marriage. Ethan, you just didn't realize it was also about the business until it was too late. For a fleeting, shocking moment, Ethan's arrogant confidence completely faltered. He glanced nervously toward the window, the city lights flickering like distant, warning fires. I built Cross Dynamics from nothing, he said quietly, almost pleading. Every deal, every single product. On patents that Sinclair Technologies owns, Ava interrupted sharply. On an elite network my family quietly helped you access. You absolutely didn't build it alone. Ethan, you just narcissistically convinced yourself you did. He met her gaze again, the defensive anger returning to his eyes. And what if I just refused to sign? What are the consequences? Ava's voice didn't rise, but it cut violently through the empty space between them like a scythe. Then I will keep slowly tightening the noose. Every single contract, every supplier, every major investor you rely on to breathe, I will be there first. Your stock will bleed out its value. Your own board will violently vote you out in disgrace. And when it's all completely over, you'll be nothing but a pathetic footnote in a business journal article about corporate arrogance. A heavy, terrified silence settled between them. The waiter returned to silently refill their water glasses, completely oblivious to the quiet, bloody war unfolding at the table. You think you've completely cornered me, Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly. But there's one crucial thing you're forgetting. I still have powerful allies, and not all of them play by your family's polite rules. Which allies? Ava asked, tilting her head with a patronizing smile. The ones who already called me desperately this week begging for a deal, or the ones who've been quietly selling off their shares before the next quarter's disastrous report. He blinked rapidly. The slightest, terrified pause revealing the horrible truth to him. He had no one left. What's this really about, Ava? Ethan asked, shifting tactics to emotional manipulation. Is it revenge? Proving to the world you're stronger than me? Her expression softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with absolute certainty. It's entirely about our child. I will absolutely not let their future name be tied to your public recklessness. This isn't petty vengeance, Ethan. This is total protection. For the very first time that night, his eyes dropped to her midsection, to the subtle, beautiful curve beneath the tailored dress. Something unreadable and deeply sad crossed his face. Deep regret, maybe, but it vanished quickly, replaced by survival instinct. "I'll give you exactly 72 hours to sign," Ava said, sliding the folder back toward him. "After that, the generous offer permanently disappears, and so does your control over the narrative." He stood up abruptly, leaving the folder sitting on the table. "You're heavily underestimating me." "No," Ava replied smoothly, sipping her water. "I just know you better than anyone else." He walked out of the restaurant without another word, his dark reflection in the glass shrinking as he moved away into the night. Back at the Sinclair estate later that night, Ava found Richard waiting anxiously in her study. "Well," he asked. "He's stalling," Ava said, sinking exhausted into her plush chair. "He's just not ready to publicly admit he's totally lost." Richard handed her a thick folder of his own. "Then we make the final decision for him. We've got more than enough shareholder support to trigger a special resolution tomorrow. If we move right now, we could vote him out within 2 weeks." Ava looked closely at the papers, then shook her head. "Not yet. Let him feel the clock ticking down on him." In his dark penthouse, Ethan poured himself a massive drink and dialed a shady number he hadn't called in years. "It's Ethan," he said when the secure line picked up. "I desperately need a major favor. Something completely off the books." The sleazy voice on the other end chuckled darkly. "Sounds like serious trouble." "You have absolutely no idea," Ethan replied. 2 nights later, Ava's head of security entered her office with a deeply grim expression. "We've got a very serious problem. Someone's been aggressively digging into your private financial accounts and your personal travel schedule." On his desk, he threw down a surveillance photo of Ava leaving the St. Regis. The man lurking in the background, partially hidden by a pillar, was undeniably Ethan. The photo lay on Ava's desk like a stark, terrifying warning. Ethan lurking in the background of her meeting wasn't a mere coincidence. It was active, desperate surveillance. And surveillance meant he was totally done playing strictly in the polite corporate arena. Richard paced furiously in front of her desk. "If he's moving into dangerous, personal territory, we need to massively escalate your security detail immediately. You absolutely cannot risk being caught off guard while pregnant." Ava calmly closed the folder containing the creepy photo. "Security? Yes, absolutely. But I am not hiding in this house. If he desperately wants to watch me, I'll happily give him a public performance worth remembering." A week later, the prestigious International Business Leadership Forum was set to host a massive, globally televised panel on the future of predictive technology. Ava had been confirmed as the main keynote speaker months ago. Ethan's name surprisingly appeared on the panel list just 2 days before the event, added at the aggressive insistence of one of the major sponsors. It was painfully obvious he desperately wanted to share the stage, maybe even publicly challenge or humiliate her. Richard wasn't thrilled about the ambush. "It's a complete setup, Ava. He'll try to aggressively bait you on live TV." "Then I'll just bait him first," Ava replied confidently, preparing her notes. The morning of the high-stakes panel, Ava's PR head briefed her urgently in the green room. "Half the tech industry's eyes are locked on this feed. If you land the right verbal hit, you can completely push him over the edge publicly." Ava nodded. "And if I push him far enough, his board will finally see him for exactly the unstable liability what he is." The plan was incredibly simple. Control the narrative, keep her total composure, and plant massive seeds of public doubt in the minds of cross-dynamics remaining loyalists. The panel began under incredibly bright stage lights. Cameras panned excitedly over the massive audience, CEOs, wealthy investors, hungry reporters, before settling on the impressive lineup of speakers. Ava sat poised in a sleek navy dress. Ethan sat 2 chairs down in a sharp charcoal suit, looking incredibly tense. The moderator opened the discussion with broad, softball questions about innovation and market trends. Ava answered with brilliant precision, speaking eloquently about corporate transparency, sustainable growth, and the heavy responsibility of tech leaders to think beyond short-term quarterly profits. When Ethan's turn came, he aggressively emphasized reckless risk-taking, speed over hesitation, and ruthlessly owning the market before anyone else can. It was cheap corporate philosophy dressed up as macho bravado. Midway through the panel, the moderator asked a pointed question. What do you all think is the absolute biggest threat to innovation in this space today? Ethan smirked arrogantly, leaning into his mic. Interference. When larger competitors meddle in projects they didn't even start, just to steal the credit later. It was a blatant, petty shot directly across the table at Ava. Ava smiled slightly, unfazed. The real threat isn't competition, she said smoothly into her microphone. It's pure arrogance. Leaders who falsely believe they're untouchable eventually stop listening. They stop adapting, and when they stubbornly stop adapting, they lose everything. The crowd reacted with a low, shocked murmur. Ethan's jaw flexed violently, his eyes narrowing with pure hatred. Toward the very end of the panel, the moderator asked eagerly about future projects. Ava leaned in confidently. Sinclair Technologies is currently preparing to launch a massive platform that will seamlessly integrate predictive analytics into global logistics. We fully expect to hold exclusive patent rights in absolutely every single sector that relies on these technologies. Every sector. The phrase hung heavily in the air. Industry insiders knew exactly what that meant. Ethan's flagship product would be completely, legally locked out of key global markets. Ethan turned aggressively toward her, his face red. And if those rights were legally challenged in court? Ava didn't miss a beat. We'd win easily. We've been winning in court for months. The moderator tried to nervously pivot, but Ethan's angry voice cut through the room. And what exactly happens when the person making those corporate decisions has petty, personal vendettas driving them? It was incredibly reckless, far too personal for a public, professional forum. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cameras zoomed in tightly on Ava's face, waiting eagerly for her reaction. She met his furious gaze, completely calm and unflinching. Personal history absolutely doesn't change hard facts. And the undeniable fact is, true leadership is about providing stability, which is exactly why shareholders should think incredibly carefully about who they trust with the future of their company. The blow was impeccably clean and utterly devastating. After the explosive panel, in the chaotic green room afterward, reporters aggressively crowded Ava with questions. She answered them selectively, keeping the entire focus strictly on her projects. Ethan was standing across the room, speaking in furious, hushed tones to his panicked COO. His face was tight and highly controlled, but his shaking hands gave him away, flexing and clenching like he was barely containing a violent outburst. Richard slipped smoothly beside Ava. We've just got calls from 2 more Cross Dynamics board members. They're ready to talk to us. Good, Ava said coldly. Set the meetings. That night, Ethan furiously confronted his COO in his office. You told me this panel was my chance to publicly show strength. Instead, she made me look like I was totally unraveling on live TV. His COO didn't even try to deny it. Because you are unraveling, Ethan. You're fighting entirely on her terms. And the board's starting to seriously ask if you can handle the pressure of this job anymore. Ethan violently grabbed his coat. Then I'll show them pressure. The next morning at 8 o'clock a.m. sharp, Ava's PR team was urgently alerted to a massive press release from Cross Dynamics. Ethan Cross announces aggressive expansion plan to outpace Sinclair Technologies. It was incredibly bold, borderline suicidal, especially without the actual capital to back up the promises. Ava's chief legal counsel looked up from reading the release. If he actually pushes this through, he'll burn completely through his remaining cash reserves in less than 6 months. Ava's smile was terrifyingly cold. Then we just need to make absolutely sure the burn happens faster. That afternoon, Ava received a creepy, anonymous envelope delivered to her office. Inside was a single, crumpled page torn from a legal pad. In Ethan's bold handwriting, it read, "You're not the only one who knows how to play dirty. See you at the gala." The city's legendary Winter Charity Gala was the exact kind of event that made front-page headlines and filled glossy magazine spreads globally. Under the magnificent vaulted ceiling of the glasshouse pavilion, glittering, massive snowflake chandeliers hung above a sea of sequined designer gowns and custom tuxedos. The air was incredibly crisp with the scent of fresh pine garlands and astronomically expensive perfume. Ava stepped gracefully out of her car into a blinding blizzard of camera flashes. She wore a breathtaking white satin gown with a dramatic cape that trailed behind her like fresh, pristine snow. Priceless diamonds glimmered brilliantly at her throat and wrists, and a single, flawless pearl pin, her late mother's, anchored her sleek chignon. Tonight wasn't just about charity. It was about absolute, final closure. Music swelled beautifully from a live orchestra. Wealthy guests sipped vintage champagne, exchanging polite pleasantries under towering floral arrangements. But there was a massive undercurrent of tension in the room. People knew a violent storm was brewing between Ava Sinclair and Ethan Cross. Ethan arrived 20 minutes later with a miserable-looking Sienna clinging to his arm. He was dressed sharply in midnight blue, highly polished and smiling aggressively for the cameras. But the exact moment he saw Ava holding court across the room, his fake smile faltered just enough for the waiting photographers to catch his fear. Richard appeared quietly at Ava's side. "Our allies are firmly here. 3 more key board members just confirmed they'll vote with us if it comes down to a hostile takeover." Ava glanced briefly toward Ethan, who was aggressively shaking hands with a venture capitalist she'd already secretly secured on her side. "Then tonight, we finally give them the undeniable reason to move against him." The evening's packed schedule called for inspiring speeches, a massive live auction, and a grand closing toast. Ava knew exactly where she would make her final move. Midway through the night, the auctioneer enthusiastically presented a final, surprise lot, an exclusive, highly lucrative partnership opportunity with Sinclair Technologies to jointly develop a charitable tech initiative. The bidding started incredibly high. Ethan aggressively raised his paddle. The crowd murmured in shock. It was highly unusual for one company to aggressively bid on a direct rival's philanthropic project, but Ethan clearly wanted a PR headline. Ava calmly let him push the number higher and higher, her expression entirely unreadable. When the price finally reached a staggering, absurd figure that he couldn't afford, she calmly lifted her paddle and doubled his bid. The room erupted in gasps. Cameras flashed wildly. Ethan's jaw tightened until his teeth almost cracked. Near midnight, the MC invited Ava up to give the grand closing toast. She stepped confidently to the microphone, her voice carrying with effortless, supreme authority. "Tonight, we've successfully raised over $14 million for causes that matter deeply to this city," she announced to thunderous applause. "But more than that, we've seen exactly what can happen when leaders truly commit to vision, absolute integrity, and collaboration." She paused, letting her powerful gaze sweep the entire room before settling briefly, pointedly, and lethally on Ethan. "The future absolutely belongs to those who put true purpose above fragile ego. And that is exactly how I will continue to lead in every single arena." The applause was immediate and deafening, the message completely unmistakable. As the crowd mingled, Ethan furiously approached her near the exit. "You really think this little theatrical performance will push me out?" Ava smiled a faint, pitying smile. "It's not just tonight, Ethan. It's been months of you completely losing control. This is just the grand finale." He stepped menacingly closer, lowering his voice. "I can still make this incredibly ugly for you." "You already did," she said coldly, turning away from him. Richard intercepted her before she reached the exit doors. "We have the votes," he whispered happily. "The board is officially calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Ethan will be formally asked to resign immediately." Ava exhaled slowly. It was finally happening. After months of brilliant strategic moves, careful pressure, and massive public victories, the endgame was here. The next day, in Cross Dynamics' glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere was incredibly heavy. The special resolution passed with a massive, decisive majority. Ethan's resignation was demanded immediately. He didn't even look at Ava as he was escorted out of the building by security, Sienna trailing miserably behind him. Cameras swarmed them, but he kept his head down in utter disgrace. Weeks later, the press officially announced the massive merger of Cross Dynamics into Sinclair Technologies. With Ava firmly at the helm of the combined operations, share prices surged to record highs. Top industry analysts called her moves a brilliant masterclass in corporate strategy. But to Ava, it was infinitely more than that. It was the final, total reclaiming of her life, her name, and her mother's legacy. That evening, she stood peacefully on the balcony of the Sinclair estate, the crisp winter air brushing against her skin. Richard joined her, handing her a glass of celebratory champagne. "You completely won," he said simply. Ava looked out over the sparkling city lights. "I didn't just win. I built something actually worth winning for." Her hand rested lovingly on her stomach. The future wasn't just about ruthless business. It was entirely about family, absolute stability, and never, ever letting anyone dictate her worth again. In her final, highly publicized press interview of the year, Ava summed it all up perfectly for the world. True strength isn't about never falling down. It's about standing up so incredibly tall after you've been knocked down, that absolutely no one can ever push you the same way again. That's what every woman should remember. Your story is entirely yours to write. As the cameras clicked, Ava received a text from an unknown number. It read, "Enjoy your temporary victory. The game never really ends." Her powerful smile didn't falter this time. She was ready for whatever came next. So that's how the story closes. My friends, you're still here with me, right? If you've stayed until now, then something deep in Ava's incredible journey has touched your heart in its own unique way. Maybe it's the burning fire of justice. Maybe it's the quiet, unshakable strength she carried through her darkest moments. Or maybe it's the profound reminder that absolutely no one gets to write your ending but you. You see, life isn't about desperately avoiding the storms. It's about learning exactly how to stand tall and resolute in the middle of them. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers, once wisely said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find incredible strength." Ava's beautiful story shows exactly that. She couldn't control Ethan's cruel betrayal, the vicious rumors, or the toxic corporate games. But she absolutely could control her choices, her fierce dignity, and her spectacular comeback. And she bravely chose not just to barely survive, but to rise infinitely higher than ever before. Sometimes cruel people will try to permanently define you by your absolute weakest moment. They'll try to maliciously make you believe that your intrinsic worth depends entirely on their fragile approval. But here is the undeniable truth. You are the sole author of your story. As Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Ava reacted not with petty bitterness, but with brilliant strategy, immense courage, and deep purpose. And maybe you're currently facing your own Ethan right now, a toxic person, a massive challenge, a painful season of loss. Please remember, you are absolutely not powerless. The deep pain you feel today can be the powerful fuel for the incredible life you build tomorrow. You can bravely step forward, reclaim your name, and write an epic ending that makes you profoundly proud. If this story stirred something deep inside you, if it beautifully reminded you that true strength can be quiet, incredibly graceful, and absolutely unstoppable, then I enthusiastically invite you to keep walking this beautiful path of growth with us. Please hit that like button. Share this empowering video with someone in your life who really needs a reminder of their own power. And absolutely subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next incredible journey we take together. Because, my friends, the world will always keep throwing storms at us, but together, we will keep learning exactly how to dance in the rain. See you in the next story.